"You don't know who I am," Theodore shouted, his voice rising with fury, shoving his hand into Aliyah's chest. "You're nothing. A poor, insignificant girl who thinks she's a billionaire." Aliyah's heart pounded in her chest. She looked up at him, barely whispering, "I'm not lying. I am a billionaire." Asterisk. Theodore let out a harsh laugh, dismissing her completely. "A joke. All of you are the same. Just stay in your place." And just like that, in the chaos of an everyday shopping trip, one word place tore through the room. No one could have imagined the shock waves it would send. Aliyah's response, a quiet defiance in the face of his mockery, would ripple outward, shaking more than just this grocery store, as Theodore sneered, not realizing who Aliyah truly was. The moment passed, but that moment so small and so powerful was about to ignite a storm no one was ready for, a storm that would leave the powerful trembling and a young woman finally standing tall. Welcome back, everyone. And before we jump in, thank you for helping us hit 200 subscribers. Every new sub feels like a door opening. And today's story is one of those stories that remind you why you should never judge a door by its appearance. Because what if I told you? A billionaire CEO publicly humiliated a quiet black waitress after she calmly said she was a billionaire too. And what if I also told you? The CEO had no idea who he was talking to. No idea that the woman he mocked was connected to power far beyond his boardroom. No idea that her brother, the man who would later walk into the room, was a decorated general with enough authority to end his career in a single conversation. This story is full of lies, pride, hidden identity, and the one twist that turns a waitress into the most important person in the building. Thank you again for helping this channel grow to 200 subs. So also let me know where you're watching from. Strap in because you're about to find out what really happened that day, but you couldn't see it yet. You couldn't see what Aliyah carried behind her eyes or the power that pulsed silently beneath her calm exterior. Because while Theodore thought he could bully this young black waitress with impunity, what he didn't know was that Aliyah wasn't who he thought she was, and what would happen next would turn the tables completely. Aliyah's story, like so many, had begun with 1,000 small humiliations, little jabs, little moments where she had been overlooked or dismissed simply because of her appearance. Growing up in Washington, D.C., she had learned that people didn't always see her as she truly was, and on that particular afternoon in Capitol Groceries, her patience finally ran out. She had been here before serving the entitled, the rude, the people who treated her like she was invisible. But this time, it was different. This time, Aliyah wasn't just any waitress, she was a sister to someone far more powerful than anyone in that store could have imagined. Aliyah's hand trembled as she gripped the edge of the counter, trying to steady herself. The weight of Theodore's words sank deep into her chest, but she didn't let it show. She was used to the weight of humiliation, the sharp sting of being looked down upon, dismissed, overlooked always, the person no one truly saw. Just a face in a crowd, just another black woman in a uniform. It had always been like this. She thought back to all the moments that had built up over the years, all the small cuts that had bled into her spirit until she wasn't sure where the pain ended and where the numbness began. From high school, when her classmates looked through her like she wasn't there, to the customers who ignored her pleas for patience or their requests for a better attitude. Aliyah had long ago learned that her worth didn't matter, not in this city, not in the world. But this time, today, she was tired. Tired of being the invisible one. Tired of being the one who had to swallow her anger, her hurt, her frustration. Today, Theodore had pushed her too far, and, for the first time, she didn't want to just let it slide. "You don't know who I am," Theodore barked again, his voice rising. His hand slapped the counter with a force that made several heads turn. "I don't need to be wasting my time with someone like you. You're nothing but a failure, a joke." Aliyah's jaw tightened, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. His words were nothing new. She had heard them 1,000 times before from people like him. But today, something was different. Maybe it was the years of unspoken resentment. Maybe it was the way he waved his privilege in her face like a banner. Whatever it was, she wasn't going to let it slide this time. "I'm not lying," she said quietly, but with a firmness that even surprised her. I times am times a billionaire. Theodore stared at her, his eyes narrowing in disbelief. He took a step closer, looming over her, as though his very presence would crush her. A billionaire? You? Ha! He laughed again, this time more cruelly. Look at you. What a joke. Who the hell do you think you're fooling? You're nothing. Just another wannabe playing dress-up in a uniform. His words cut deeper than she would have liked to admit. For a moment, Aliyah's mind flashed to the empty bank account in her head, the looming rent she could never quite make on time, the small paycheck that never seemed enough. She clenched her fists under the counter, forcing the anger back down. She had dealt with worse before. People like Theodore always needed someone to belittle to feel better about themselves. She wasn't going to be his target today. But as the words left his mouth, Aliyah felt something else simmer inside her, a feeling she hadn't let herself feel in a long time. Power. Before she could fully process the moment, Theodore grabbed her arm and jerked her toward him. The movement was sudden, forceful, and shocking. Don't lie to me, little girl, he spat. You're just a waitress. You think you're someone? You're nothing. His grip tightened, and for a second Aliyah thought he might squeeze the life out of her. But then, something snapped in her. She wasn't the invisible one today. The force of his hand on her arm sent a shock through her body. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she held her ground. The eyes of the other customers around her burned into her, some looking away, others unsure whether to intervene. But in that moment, Aliyah realized something. She wasn't invisible anymore, and she wasn't going to stay in her place. You're wrong, she said softly, her voice steady despite the chaos inside. I'm not who you think I am. Theodore's smirk faltered for just a fraction of a second before he scoffed, dismissing her entirely. He looked over his shoulder, raising his voice for all to hear. Someone get the manager. This girl times is out of control. But in that split second, Aliyah did something that no one in the store, not even Theodore, could have predicted. With a steady hand, she pressed the small device hidden in the pocket of her apron. A faint beep, almost imperceptible, vibrated in her hand. Her emergency beacon was activated. Her sister would know. Olivia would know. As the situation unfolded, Aliyah's pulse raced, but she didn't let it show. She had done what she needed to do. The beacon would send her sister a signal, a warning, and for the first time in a long while, Aliyah felt a sense of control she hadn't known she had. But this wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. And while Theodore still ranted, oblivious to the storm about to descend on him, the other customers, some of them filming, some whispering among themselves, Aliyah's mind was already far ahead. She didn't need to take this anymore. The time for playing along was over. If you believe everyone deserves respect, subscribe now, because what happens next is a game changer for justice. When the world looks away, sometimes one act of defiance is all it takes to make it stand still. Keep watching. The atmosphere in Capitol Groceries was thick with tension. Theodore's voice boomed through the aisles, a mixture of fury and mockery, but no one dared step forward to stop him. Aliyah stood there, her arm still stinging from where he had grabbed her, her gaze fixed on the floor. Her heart raced, but she refused to let him see the fear. Across the room, a teenage boy, no older than 16, watched the entire exchange unfold. His hands, gripped tightly around the phone he held, trembled ever so slightly. He'd been on the receiving end of enough bullying himself to understand what was happening, even if he couldn't put it into words just yet. The boy's fingers hovered over the screen, but the decision to record came to him slowly. He glanced around. No one else was doing anything. The manager was behind the counter, a neutral observer at best, not lifting a finger to help. Customers shifted uncomfortably, some whispering to one another, but no one had the courage to step in. That's when the boy did what no one else had the guts to do. He hit record. His hand shook a little as he focused the camera on Theodore, and then he aimed it at Aliyah, capturing the scene as Theodore's insults flew faster than ever. "You're a liar," Theodore shouted, his face twisted with disgust. "Nothing but a fraud. What a joke you are." Aliyah kept her chin up, but her mind was elsewhere. The sight of the boy recording was a small comfort, but it wasn't enough. She needed more. The boy's shaky camera angle was a testament to his nervousness, but his eyes never wavered. This wasn't just about capturing a moment, it was about witnessing something larger than himself. He knew it. As Theodore's insults continued to rain down on her, Aliyah met his eyes with a quiet resolve. It was as if the anger, the frustration, and the humiliation that had built up over the years exploded inside her all at once, propelling her to speak in a way she hadn't before. "You have no idea who I am," she said, her voice calm but full of weight. It wasn't loud. It wasn't a dramatic outburst. It was simply a declaration, one that caught both Theodore and the onlookers by surprise. The words hung in the air for a brief moment. Theodore's jaw clenched, his smug expression faltering. He looked around, confused by the sudden shift in her demeanor. Was she trying to intimidate him? Was she bluffing? He couldn't tell. All he knew was that he wasn't backing down. "You think you can threaten me?" he sneered, his eyes narrowing. "You're nothing but a failure in a uniform." Aliyah didn't flinch. Her mind raced, but she held her ground. The boy's phone still recorded, capturing everything. Just then, the sound of footsteps echoed through the store. The manager, still standing by the counter, had made a decision. His hands trembled slightly as he picked up the phone on the counter. "I'm calling the police," he muttered under his breath, almost too quietly for anyone to hear. It wasn't until he stepped forward and spoke louder that the crowd took notice. Within minutes, the sound of sirens could be heard approaching from down the street. The boy, still filming, could feel the tension growing, but he didn't stop. 2 officers arrived shortly after, their uniforms pressing heavily against their bodies as they pushed through the door. Officer Davidson, the more senior of the 2, surveyed the room with a hardened expression, while the younger officer followed behind, visibly uncomfortable. But neither of them seemed fazed by the scene at hand. Instead, they focused immediately on Theodore, who was still fuming at Aliyah, ranting about disrespect. "This woman assaulted me," Theodore barked, pointing aggressively at Aliyah. "She's a threat to everyone here. She needs to be removed." Aliyah's heart skipped. She wanted to laugh, to scream, to push back, but she held her ground. Her chest tightened, and she looked toward the teenage boy one last time, hoping his camera would do something. Anything. Officer Davidson looked at Theodore, then at Aliyah. "What happened here?" he asked, his tone cool, detached. He wasn't asking to understand. He wasn't interested in her side of the story. He had already made up his mind. "She's lying," Theodore spat again. "She's a fraud, and I won't stand for it." His eyes were filled with anger, the kind that came from a deep-seated entitlement. Officer Davidson nodded slowly, glancing over at his partner. Neither officer seemed to consider the possibility that they might be hearing one side of the story. The younger officer fidgeted, clearly uneasy, but said nothing. Instead, he stood back, leaving the more senior officer to handle it. The boy filming continued to capture the scene, the shaking camera catching every frame of Aliyah's stoic face, the rage of Theodore, and the indifference of the officers. The tension thickened as Aliyah stood there, exposed, vulnerable, yet something inside her refused to break. The world around her was slipping away, but she wasn't going anywhere, not today. Watching someone stand up against injustice shouldn't feel like a rarity. If you believe that all people deserve respect, subscribe now and stay with us, because what's coming next will challenge everything you thought you knew about power and the people who hold it. The atmosphere in Capitol Groceries grew even heavier as the 2 officers stepped closer to Aliyah, their eyes fixed on her like she was the problem. Officer Davidson, the taller of the 2, kept his expression neutral, unbothered and distant, but there was something in the way he looked at her that made her feel like she was already guilty before she had even said a word. Aliyah stood her ground, her body tense but her posture firm. She had been through enough to know when things were about to get worse, and this was definitely one of those times. "What's your side of the story?" Officer Davidson asked, though his tone made it clear that he wasn't interested in hearing it. He was already looking past her, at Theodore, who had resumed his tirade. "She attacked me. Look at what she did to my arm," Theodore barked. lifting his sleeve and pointing to a slight redness where Aliyah had pulled away from his grip. "I was just trying to have a conversation, and she assaulted me." Aliyah opened her mouth to explain, but the words seemed to die before they reached her lips. The officers were already looking at her like she was the aggressor. She had always known that when people like Theodore held power, the truth wasn't enough. "I didn't attack him." "I didn't," Aliyah began, but the moment she opened her mouth, Officer Davidson held up a hand to stop her. "You're making a scene," he said, cutting her off with a dismissive tone. "We're just here to make sure things don't escalate. But frankly, it sounds like you've already caused enough trouble." Her heart sank as she watched him turn to Theodore. The officer's bias was glaringly obvious. It wasn't about hearing the truth. It wasn't about investigating the situation. It was about aligning with the person who seemed to matter more, the one with the status. And that was exactly what Theodore was counting on. "This is what happens when you let people like her think they can get away with things," Theodore continued, his voice dripping with arrogance. "You don't even know what kind of person she is. Who does she think she is? Talking back to me like that." Aliyah felt her chest tighten. She was used to this, to being told she was nothing, to being erased in the eyes of people who didn't even know her, who had never bothered to see her for what she truly was. But she wasn't going to bend this time. Not for Theodore. Not for anyone. In the middle of the officers nodding and siding with Theodore, something inside Aliyah snapped. She didn't need to fight them all at once. She just needed to hold on to who she was, even if they couldn't see it. As she stood there, facing the officers who had already decided her fate, her mind drifted back to Washington, D.C., the city she'd grown up in, the city that had taught her every day that her worth wasn't about her skill, her intelligence, or her strength. It was about how much power you had and who you knew. Growing up in D.C. had been a constant reminder that people like her, young black girls, were never meant to be seen in positions of power. It wasn't just the racist comments from strangers or the constant microaggressions from teachers and classmates. It was the fact that she had never once felt like she could just be herself without constantly having to prove she belonged. Whether it was a teacher questioning her answers in class, a manager questioning her work ethic, or even strangers assuming her presence in high-end spaces was an accident, Aliyah had grown used to being ignored, dismissed, or worse, treated like she was invisible. But despite everything, she had survived. Her pride had survived. And today, she wasn't going to let anyone take that from her. Just as Officer Davidson opened his mouth to speak again, something shifted. The buzzing of her phone in her apron pocket was almost imperceptible, but it felt like a jolt of electricity. Aliyah knew the alert had gone off. The emergency beacon she had been carrying for years now had been triggered. General Olivia would know. Aliyah's older sister, General Olivia, had been the one who insisted on the device after Aliyah had faced harassment at work multiple times in the past. Olivia had always been the protective one, the one who looked out for Aliyah, making sure she was safe, even when Aliyah insisted she didn't need it. But today, the weight of that device in her pocket suddenly felt like the only lifeline she had. Meanwhile, Officer Davidson was still focused on Theodore, nodding along with his every word, completely uninterested in hearing what Aliyah had to say. As the officers began to speak over her, Aliyah took a slow breath, eyes on the ground, willing herself not to fall apart, but she couldn't help it. Not today. Not when she knew what was coming. You've seen this kind of injustice before, when the powerful get a free pass, and the truth gets buried. If you believe that no one should be treated this way, subscribe now, because what happens next is more than just an arrest. It's a reckoning. General Olivia's phone vibrated against the desk in front of her, breaking through the focused silence of the high-stakes military briefing. She had just been outlining troop movements and strategic deployments when the alert came through, an emergency notification linked directly to her sister, Aliyah. Her breath hitched when she saw the location flashing on the screen. Capitol Groceries, the small grocery store in the heart of Washington, D.C., where Aliyah worked. Olivia didn't waste a second. The briefing room, filled with high-ranking officers and military strategists, fell silent as she swiftly cut off the conversation. She grabbed her phone, voice steady but urgent. "Activate the rapid response unit. Get me military vehicles and personnel on the ground immediately." This is a direct order. Her mind raced as she clicked through her phone, already drafting a message to her sister's beacon. But this wasn't the first time Aliyah had faced danger or harassment. Olivia had seen the signs before. This wasn't just about a simple altercation, it was personal. As her orders were executed, Olivia's face hardened. She had never hesitated when it came to protecting her sister. But today, it wasn't just about her. This was bigger than Aliyah. This was about making sure the world saw just how wrong the system was. Meanwhile, just a few blocks away, a teenage boy stared at his phone, his heart racing. The video he had just captured Aliyah, the calm yet powerful waitress, facing down the entitled CEO, was now live. He hesitated for a moment before clicking post. His shaky hands steadied as he watched the video load. The image of Theodore, his face contorted with arrogance and cruelty, and Aliyah's defiance, her quiet strength in the face of overwhelming disrespect, was already starting to take shape as something that would resonate. His phone buzzed in his hand, but this time it was a notification, a comment, then another, then another. Within minutes, the video spread like wildfire. The teenager didn't realize the full weight of what he had just done. He wasn't trying to start a revolution. He was simply recording the moment of injustice that he couldn't turn a blind eye to. But now, people everywhere were watching. Activists, news outlets, ordinary citizens who had seen the same things over and over again: racial prejudice, systemic abuse of power, and the silence of those who stood by and did nothing. The video was quickly shared on social media, tagged by journalists, influencers, and everyday people alike. The comments flooded in, calls for justice, for change, for accountability. Back in the store, Aliyah was still surrounded by the officers. They had her pinned into a corner, making her feel like the criminal, despite her being the one who had been harassed. But something was different now. The tension in the air was palpable, thickening with each passing second. Aliyah's heart was pounding in her chest. She had been through this before: the police who never listened, the managers who never intervened. It was always the same. But this time, it was different. She could feel it. The growing buzz from the store's customers was unmistakable. They weren't looking at her like she was the problem anymore. They were looking at the officers, some whispering, some filming. But there was more. She could hear the faint sound of sirens, the rumble of something much bigger approaching. Her thoughts raced back to the emergency beacon. Olivia would know by now. And as she stood there, waiting for whatever was coming next, she felt a shift in the air. It wasn't just the customers. It wasn't just the officers. It was something else, something bigger. The moment the sound of military vehicles rolled into the street outside, the entire store went silent. People began to whisper, pointing at the windows, watching the growing presence outside. And that's when Aliyah realized the game was changing. Outside, a convoy of military trucks began to pull up to the curb, soldiers jumping into formation. The heavy sound of boots hitting the pavement echoed through the streets. The officers inside the store stiffened, glancing at each other, unsure of what to do. The power they had once wielded was now slipping from their hands. As the tension inside the store reached a fever pitch, Aliyah saw Officer Davidson glance nervously toward the door. He could see the military presence just outside, but he refused to acknowledge the shift in power. Instead, he glanced back at Theodore, who was still ranting, oblivious to the growing storm around him. The boy's video had started a chain reaction, a ripple that was spreading through the entire city, changing the way people saw the injustice unfolding. And as the military vehicles lined the street outside, Aliyah felt something shift in her own heart. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It wasn't about being silenced. This was her moment. Sometimes, it takes one video, one act of courage, to change everything. Subscribe now, because this is just the beginning of a story that needs to be heard. The rumble of military trucks grew louder as they approached Capitol Groceries. Soldiers, dressed in full gear, jumped out of the vehicles with military precision, their boots hitting the pavement in a steady, rhythmic beat. The sound was enough to make anyone pause. But it wasn't just the noise, it was the sheer presence of it all. This wasn't a situation to be ignored anymore. General Olivia Wells didn't need to say a word. Her arrival on the scene spoke volumes in itself. She strode toward the store with the calm authority of someone who had seen more chaos than she cared to remember. Behind her, military vehicles lined the street, blocking off traffic, while soldiers formed a perimeter around Capitol Groceries. There was no denying it. This had escalated far beyond what anyone inside the store had anticipated. Inside, the tension was palpable. The officers, already on edge, shot nervous glances at each other. They had been handling the situation with an air of indifference, dismissing Aliyah's claims and focusing on Theodore's story. But now, as the first hum of military helicopters overhead made the air vibrate with intensity, they knew something had shifted. The power balance had swung, and it wasn't in their favor anymore. Olivia's eyes scanned the store as she entered, her gaze sharp and unflinching. The officers froze, their hands moving ever so slightly toward their holsters, as if unsure of what the next move should be. But it was too late. Olivia was already there. "You," she said, her voice as cold and commanding as a battlefield. The officer closest to her, a younger man, tensed up, not sure if he should acknowledge her or even respond. But she wasn't waiting for permission. "Release my sister," she ordered. Her words hung in the air like a challenge. The officers exchanged a glance, hesitant. They had been in control of the situation just moments ago, but now, standing before Olivia Wells, they realized they were out of their depth. The general's reputation had preceded her. Her name carried more weight than any badge they wore. Officer Davidson, still holding on to his confidence, stepped forward. His jaw clenched, and he tried to project authority, but it wavered under Olivia's unwavering gaze. "We're just doing our job here. She's the one causing trouble. Release her," Olivia repeated, her tone unwavering. There was no compromise in her voice. No room for negotiation. The officers hesitated again, but the weight of her words, backed by the presence of military power, was too much to ignore. The younger officer slowly began to unclasp the cuffs around Aliyah's wrists, his fingers fumbling with the keys as he did so. Aliyah felt the cold metal snap off her wrists, but she didn't move right away. Her mind was still racing. She had expected this, expected some form of retribution, but she hadn't expected to feel this, relief. For the first time, the pressure of the situation was beginning to lift. Theodore, however, wasn't ready to accept defeat. He had been watching the scene unfold in shock, his face reddening with frustration. He'd been the one in control until now, but that control was slipping. As Olivia's troops continued to swarm the parking lot, he stepped forward, trying to regain some of his previous confidence. "I don't know who you think you are," Theodore sneered, his voice shaking with anger. "But you have no right to interfere in this. I'll have you know, I've got powerful friends. You can't just— I am General Olivia Wells." Her voice cut through his words like a blade. She didn't need to raise it. Her presence alone was enough to silence him. Olivia didn't flinch, standing perfectly still as she let the weight of her name land on him like a hammer. Theodore's mouth opened and closed, like a fish out of water, but no words came out. His eyes darted between Olivia's unwavering gaze and the growing crowd of soldiers now surrounding him. He could feel the eyes of the other customers on him, the air thick with the change in the atmosphere. His face turned pale as the reality of the situation set in. Aliyah, the nobody he had humiliated, was the sister of someone who could dismantle him with a single phone call. The confidence that had once flowed so freely from him began to crumble. Olivia didn't need to say another word. She turned to her sister, giving her a single nod. Aliyah, still in shock, finally exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. As Theodore stood there, realizing the magnitude of the mistake he'd just made, he was left to stew in his own humiliation. His power was no longer enough to shield him from the consequences of his actions. Aliyah, with the support of her sister and the weight of the military backing her, was finally free. It only takes one person, one act of courage to change everything. If you believe that justice should never be denied, subscribe now. What's happening here will make the world stop and listen. General Olivia's presence had turned the tide in a way that no one inside Capitol Groceries could have anticipated. As the officers, still in disbelief, fumbled with Aliyah's handcuffs. The weight of Olivia's authority loomed over them like a storm about to break. Her eyes never left the officers as they hesitated, unsure of what to do next. "Release her," Olivia commanded again, her voice low and unyielding, each word ringing with finality. There was no room for argument. The officers, caught between their duty to maintain control and their growing fear of the situation, had no choice but to comply. The younger officer, still visibly shaken, quickly unlocked the cuffs, stepping back as if afraid to provoke any further reaction from the general. Aliyah stood tall as the cold metal fell from her wrists. It wasn't just freedom she was feeling, it was dignity. The humiliation that had weighed on her shoulders for so long was finally lifting, piece by piece. For a moment, there was silence. Theodore stood frozen, his face pale, his arrogance now completely stripped away. He had assumed control of this situation, had thought he was the one who held all the power. But now, as the reality of what was happening sank in, he realized how wrong he had been. Aliyah glanced at Olivia, her sister's unwavering confidence filling her with strength. Olivia's gaze softened just slightly, but there was no mistaking the force behind her presence. It was the kind of strength that commanded respect, not through violence or intimidation, but through the sheer force of conviction. The officers stepped aside, unwilling to escalate things further. They had already lost the battle. But Theodore wasn't done yet. "I don't know who you think you are," Theodore sneered, his voice shaking but still trying to maintain some semblance of control. "But this isn't over. I'll make sure both of you pay for this. You have no idea who you're messing with." Aliyah, now standing free, could feel her heart pounding. But instead of shrinking under Theodore's insults, she stepped forward, meeting his gaze with calm defiance. "Asterisk, I know exactly who you are, asterisk," she said, her voice steady, cutting through the air like a blade. "And I know exactly what you tried to do to me. But it ends here." For a moment, Theodore's face twitched, confusion and frustration clouding his features. He had no response. He could feel the power slipping through his fingers, and the more he tried to push back, the more it eluded him. The viral video that had been recorded by the teenage boy was already making waves across social media, picking up traction far beyond anything Theodore could have anticipated. Within minutes, the story had spread like wildfire. News outlets were picking it up. Activists were sharing it. Ordinary citizens, appalled by the scene, had rallied behind Aliyah's courage. The teenager's shaky footage, which had started as just a simple act of defiance, was now a weapon in a larger battle for justice. The video painted a clear picture. It wasn't just about the harassment of a waitress by a rich CEO. It was about the systemic abuse of power, about the way people like Theodore had been allowed to get away with treating others as less than human. The video showed Theodore's cruelty, his attempts to humiliate Aliyah, and the officers who had taken his side without question. As the video spread, more people began to speak out. Other customers who had witnessed the altercation and had been silent began to find their voices. "That's not right," one of them muttered to the officer, who had been watching, barely even hiding their disgust. "She didn't deserve that." The power that Theodore once wielded in his arrogance was now fading. The narrative had shifted, and no matter how much he tried to justify his actions, the truth had already made its mark. Asterisk. "You're finished, asterisk," Aliyah said, turning to face Theodore one last time. She didn't yell. She didn't need to. The message was clear, and for the first time, it was Theodore who was on the defensive. Aliyah's strength was enough to stand up for herself, but we all have a responsibility to stand up for those who cannot. Subscribe now, because this is a battle for respect, for justice, and for dignity. The video that had started as a teenager's quiet act of defiance quickly exploded into a global phenomenon. What had been a tense confrontation between Aliyah and Theodore in the aisles of Capitol Groceries now spread across every corner of the internet, igniting a firestorm of outrage. The hashtag number Justice for Aliyah trended worldwide within hours, with millions of people sharing, commenting, and demanding action. The footage was damning, clear evidence of a powerful man abusing his privilege and the systems in place that had allowed him to do so. Theodore's callous behavior, his unprovoked cruelty toward Aliyah, was now immortalized on countless screens. The video painted a picture of systemic racism, social privilege, and the dehumanization of the marginalized, and it was impossible to ignore. As the video continued to circulate, Theodore's once unshakable reputation began to crumble. Public figures, journalists, and activists all called for accountability. The more Theodore tried to justify his actions, the worse his situation became. News outlets piled on, dissecting every word he had said and every action he had taken. His company, a once thriving empire built on his wealth and status, faced immediate boycotts. Protesters gathered outside his corporate headquarters, demanding that he step down. His name, which had been synonymous with power and influence, became a symbol of greed and entitlement. But it wasn't just Theodore who was feeling the backlash. The two officers who had stood by and let Aliyah be humiliated were now under intense scrutiny. Investigations into their actions were launched, and the department found itself fighting to protect its officers. The video, now in the hands of media outlets, exposed not only the abuse from Theodore but also the systemic issues that allowed it to happen. Public support for Aliyah and the movement she had unintentionally started was overwhelming. Aliyah's phone buzzed non-stop with messages and notifications. She had become the face of a movement, her quiet strength, her dignity in the face of humiliation, now a beacon of resistance. Everywhere she went, people recognized her, stopped her to offer support, or simply to tell her how much she had inspired them. She had become something she had never expected to be, a symbol. But to Aliyah, it was never about fame. It had always been about fighting for what was right, about standing up for herself and those who had been pushed aside for far too long. She never asked for this, but now that she had a voice, she wasn't going to let it go unheard. Her older sister, General Olivia, stood by her every step of the way. While Olivia had always been her protector, her sister was now being recognized as a symbol of justice and power in her own right. Her military career, built on discipline and strength, now intersected with the fight for equality. Olivia had never wanted to be a figurehead for social change, but as the media turned its lens on her as well, she became a central figure in the conversation about systemic injustice. Together, Aliyah and Olivia became an unstoppable force. Their story had rippled out, touching the lives of countless others. People who had felt silenced found their voices, and for the first time, it felt like the world was starting to listen. It wasn't just about one man's humiliation of one woman, it was about the collective voices rising up against the systems that had allowed such acts of cruelty to go unchecked for far too long. The ripple effect began to spread further than anyone could have imagined. Small businesses and community leaders, inspired by Aliyah's courage, began organizing local protests. They called for greater accountability in law enforcement, demanded corporate responsibility, and started conversations in schools, homes, and workplaces. More and more individuals began to demand that the systems of privilege that protected people like Theodore be dismantled. Theodore's empire crumbled as the public outcry continued. Legal battles, public protests, and ongoing media scrutiny kept his company on the defensive, and though the damage to his reputation would never be repaired, the bigger shift was already happening. The public was no longer willing to accept the status quo. Aliyah's strength was enough to stand up for herself, but we all have a responsibility to stand up for those who cannot. Subscribe now, because this is a battle for respect, for justice, and for dignity. The day of the public tribunal arrived, and Theodore stood at the center of a storm he had never expected. His once imposing presence now seemed small and fragile as he faced the consequences of his actions. The world, through the lens of a camera, had watched as his empire fell, piece by piece. The viral video of his treatment of Aliyah had shredded the public facade he had carefully built over the years. His company was in disarray. Protests had erupted at his luxury offices. And now, in a courtroom full of cameras and onlookers, Theodore was being forced to answer for the actions that had once been so easily excused. He sat at the defendant's table, his shoulders hunched, his once confident posture now defeated. His lawyers argued fiercely, trying to salvage what remained of his reputation, but the damage was done. The video of his cruel behavior had become the face of everything wrong with unchecked privilege and power, and nothing could erase that. As Theodore sat there, his arrogance crumbled. In front of the tribunal, he tried to defend himself, but every word he spoke only deepened the hole he had dug for himself. He was no longer the powerful CEO whose words carried weight. He was just another man trying to explain away his behavior. The public, once enamored with his status, now saw him for what he truly was, a bully who had abused his position of power without consequence. Until now. Aliyah, meanwhile, had become the symbol of everything that was right about standing up for what was just. The girl who had once been invisible in the eyes of so many was now the voice of the voiceless. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was a leader in the fight against systemic racism and abuse of power. Her quiet strength had inspired millions. And as she sat in the courtroom, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes on Theodore, and she knew this was more than just her moment of triumph. It was the culmination of everything she had fought for. Her thoughts drifted back to the days of humiliation, to the years she had spent feeling small, invisible, unworthy of respect. But as the tribunal session drew to a close, she realized how far she had come. Her worth had never been tied to her job, to how others saw her, or to the oppressive system she had fought against. Her worth had always been within her. As the session ended, the gavel came down with finality, and Theodore was left to face the consequences of his actions. He was no longer the untouchable billionaire CEO. His reputation was in tatters, his company facing legal action, and his public image irrevocably damaged. The system that had once protected him was no longer on his side. Aliyah's journey, however, was just beginning. She had become more than just a figurehead in the fight for justice. She had become a leader, a beacon of hope for everyone who had ever been silenced. The world was beginning to change, and Aliyah knew that this was only the beginning. Olivia, ever the protector, stood by her sister's side. Though the battle had been won, they both knew that there was still work to be done. The military and legal victories were just the start. The real fight was changing the systems that allowed injustice to thrive. The ripple effect of Aliyah's bravery continued to spread. The story that had started in a small Washington, D.C. grocery store had ignited a conversation about race, privilege, and power that was now taking place in boardrooms, classrooms, and living rooms around the world. The public had spoken, and the message was clear. No one was above accountability. Aliyah's courage had sparked a revolution of empathy, of understanding, and of action. She knew the fight for justice would continue, but the strength to stand up for what was right was now a part of the fabric of society. This story is not over. The fight for dignity and justice continues, but Aliyah's courage has shown us that change is possible. Subscribe now, because the fight for equality starts with us. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine, so do check it out, and do well to click on the subscribe button and turn on notifications for the next story.